It did not take me more than a day to make it back to the city, and provided a good opportunity to get a feel for my new attire and the abilities it now made available to me. I was now able to avoid, fight, or outrun any of the local saurian wildlife with ease, that being the main threat in this Orwood jungle. Trinos was able to get the measure of his own new gear as well, a set of barding with a weapon/thruster system combined into it. Matched with his natural teleporting blinks, he was able to cover vast amounts of ground or maneuver in ways nearly inconceivable while in normal flight. I found myself approaching the walls just after the break of dawn, and was at the center of a substantial crowd once I had stepped off the lift carriage that had carried me over the walls and through the gale of scalding steam surrounding the city safely. Most were asking for stories of my adventures, some commenting on my new attire, others asking about the state of the wider jungle, and finally, the children who were busy chasing and playing with Trinos. It was a wholesome scene, and one that Onsa was reluctant to bring to an early end, merely informing me that the elders would like to see me as soon as I had finished catching up. I did not take overly long in finding my way to the elders in their grand hall, allowing Trinos to play with the children as I spoke to the leaders of this community. The council room was built not for private events in mind, but for large crowds, as could be determined from the many rows of seats set out on the raised steps above the center platform. The wide platform was in the center of the raised seats of the elders, and was illuminated by a magical brightness. Not so bright as to be painful to the eye, but enough to cast long, deep shadows across the room and over any spectators as well as the elders themselves, concealing them from view of one on the platform. As I stepped onto the platform and stood at its center, the leader of the elders began to intone praises and adulation for my efforts in reclaiming the outposts, as well as for the vast amount of resources I was able to collect and recover for the city while doing so. Of the many things I had found during the reclamation efforts, I had come across several large caches of Chris, and these were remarked on several times in the elder's speech, making it clear that whatever the people may have thought about their reserves in that department, the situation had been far worse than they were aware. As his speech wound down, he made it clear that I was to receive their greatest honor, to meet the patrons of the city and be granted their wisdom. As he finished, the platform I was on began to sink, taking me to a lower level. About 100 feet down, the platform stopped. The room I was now in was a pitch black, without even the air passing to make noise. Through my attire's abilities, I was able to sense that there were 9 people around me, with the one directly in front of me being the only one that was indistinct to my sightless gaze. Things began to make a bit more sense as the room began to be filled with a soft light, along with the heartfelt greetings of one of the people from my left, which was followed by the others I could now see. They were shorter than I, and the color patterns on their wings were muted, but it was clear that these were ground-bound Analar, descendants of those that were on the surface of Jam'mar during the 36 seconds in ancient times. Their forebears must have fled Jam'mar afterwards to this world before the wars had ended. I assume they chose to hide themselves behind the scenes to guide these people, not only to avoid the questions of why they seem to lack the potency of a normal Analar, as well as a sense that they were hiding from something as well. And with the city population's distaste and fear of dragons, going so far as to lay the blame for the unending streams of saurian monsters that emanated from the volcanic ridge that splits the island's north and south sides, on the very machinations of the worms. I wagered this was not an unrealistic line of assumption. By the 9 and 4, welcome back to the library. I am the recorder, and today we are looking at a little spoken of group within the Analar's numbers. One that is regarding as an ongoing shame, or as a group of misled and anachronistic people, to be pitied or scorned by proper Analar for their refusal to gain or attain their proper grace and power. That group is known as the ground-bound Analar. My perceptive patrons are sure to be aware of this fact, but this will only be a brief look at this subset of the Analar. During the event known as the 36 Seconds, where the entirety of the Analar present at the research and creation site for the race of Dragwa were stripped of their 9 wings given grace, and transformed into Manari as punishment for their crimes. This punishment was not restricted to those within what would become known as the home city of the Dragwa, but stretched to each Analar who was present on the surface of Jam'mar at that time, stripping them of the vast portion of their grace and size, but not changing their form. These Analar and their descendants are now known as the Groundbound, and for many thousands of years they were forced to hide from dragons, as well as those that laid the blame for the wars and the destruction they brought to Jam'mar at their feet. While still having their wings and the ability to fly, they only retained the barest remnant of their former grace, as well as a much shorter stature than a full Analar, closer to the height and frame of an elf or human. These changes made the Groundbound particularly vulnerable in those first few decades of their existence, forcing them to hide and seek shelter among those of the younger races that would grant it. Their own people refused to be seen with such abominations, and as such, the Groundbound have had a very long history of secrecy and hiding from the view of the greater world. And for the final years of the Wars of Feather and Scale, as well as into the reign and the ages that followed it, the Groundbound formed secret communities in which they could endure. Some were said to have fled before the end of the wars and the summoning of Anson to parts unknown via the Expedus fleet, before all contact with them and the fleet were lost. It should be no surprise that until the later years of the Age of Valor, Analar, any Analar, was a prime target for hate and violence. Between their enthrallment of Anson, their attacks on the younger races in his name, it is hard to blame the rest of Jam'mar for this violent stance. The Groundbound, while being the ones to take the bulk of this reprisal, were actually almost completely innocent of the causes for it. You see, when Vanson was summoned and he ensnared so many of both Dragon and Analar, the Groundbound, with their lack of grace and elder power, went untouched for the most part. They were too weak for Vanson's designs and too pathetic to warrant his attention. Thus, both escaped his destruction and enslavement. In the ages after the defeat of Vanson at the hand of the V's, the Groundbound would slowly begin to show themselves in a substantial way, especially after the redemption of the Analar by Her Majesty Genevieve. Further, the actions of Elbly, a Groundbound Analar himself, in establishing the city of Talion as the new capital of the Analar, made great strides in allowing the Groundbound to rejoin society. Further actions in the creation of the Path of Redemption made a clear route for any Groundbound to be able to attain grace and become a full Analar. This saw a great number of the Groundbound, the massive majority being descendants of several generations at this point, each born without their true gifts, be raised to the ranks of a high or even a grand Analar. Even with these events having been several ages past now, there are still those that exist that have no desire to walk the path of redemption. This group of Groundbound Analar tend to belong to houses or clans or other groups that suffered particularly harshly before even the 36 seconds had come to pass. And this was mostly due to their resistance or reticence to the wars in the first place. These houses feel that they are better off not counted among a people that lifted not a finger to help those that were suffering due to their failings. Many still do leave these houses to walk the path of redemption, but just as many join the houses in their refusal to be corralled into duties and a government that they neither want or respect. This ensures that the Groundbound are not likely to fade from history anytime soon. The fact that there still may be entire colonies of Groundbound out amongst the stars also guarantees that the path of redemption will have pilgrims for many years and perhaps ages to come. And with this brief look into the Groundbound Analar at its conclusion, I sincerely hope you have a better understanding of these often stubborn and headstrong reminders of the consequences of the past. As always, my perceptive patrons, thank you for both your time and your continued interest. Thank you. Until you next find your way back to the library for another entry, I have been the Recorder, and by the 9 and 4, be well, take care of yourselves and each other. The discussions went well into the night, with the Analar asking question after question, in an attempt to discern my point of origin as well as my nature. The head of the group, a scarred and very aged Analar, one who still had their grace, explained that after the loss of Jam'mar, the dragons went on a rampage, seeking revenge for the loss of their home. only by hiding deep under what was originally a vacation estate were they able to escape the dragon's wrath. The people above are the descendants of the younger races that were part of the estate, favored family, and those that had earned the Analar's trust. Over the ages, their intermingling with each other and races native to the world itself, mostly Orckin and the like, brought them to where they are now. After giving the Analar a spare copy of Ego Core's A Brief History of the Realms, and letting their leader fully take in the information contained within its covers, I was overwhelmed by the sheer mass of follow-up questions that came forth. Several hours later, not only was their curiosity sated, but I had my own revelations to consider. The Antani and Skane was not the only one of his kind on world. In fact, the volcanic ridge held several more. How many more was not known, but what was known that beyond the ridge, on the northern side of the island, was another city. This city contained the means for me to escape this world and hopefully bring back help to deal with the Antani, as well as to work on bringing this world into the greater realms. Surprisingly, they were also aware of Unka, stating he had been on this world long before they had settled it. They knew very little of him beyond his desire to have his privacy and peace. However, it was clear that he worked to protect and aid the people of the city, dropping off supplies and other essentials in the dead of night, or other times none save the Analar would see. The fact that he made his presence known to me, and multiple times no less, amazed the Analar, who said that no matter the situation, I should never decline his aid or his wisdom. At the end of our talks, it was set out that I would receive a hero's feast before I left, to make my way north, over the ridge, and hopefully back to Jam'mar to get help. Just before the platform began to rise, taking me back to the surface, delayed Analar tossed me a small gem. All he would say was that it contained those answers I sought about death and renewal, and that I should only break and partake of the knowledge if I truly was ready for the implications that it would reveal, and not before I had made it back to Jam'mar. As I parted ways with the Analar and met again with the elders, there was a palpable buzz in town, as the feast was already being prepared for. Trinos would get to eat his little heart out, and I would get a final chance to thank the people of this place, and seek to gain any last morsels of information and lore to aid me in this journey.